The Roman Empire did not fall in a blaze. It didn't shatter like a dropped statue or collapse in a single scream of battle. It faded, like a torch left out in the wind, flickering, shrinking, dimming, long before anyone thought to shield it. For centuries, Rome had been the unshakable heart of the world. Roads radiated from it like veins, armies marched in its name across continents. Its laws, its gods, its emperors, all of it felt eternal. But eternity has a strange habit of ending quietly, and in the late 4th century, if you walked the streets of Rome, the cracks were already there. Not the kind carved by chisels or earthquakes, but the kind carved by people. Old families clung to titles they no longer earned. Senators argued over privileges while the treasury bled gold. Generals fought each other more than the enemy. Tax collectors squeezed the provinces dry, while the poor filled the streets with hungry eyes and empty bowls. And still, Rome told itself the same story it had told for 1,000 years. We are the empire. We cannot fall. But whispers crept through the markets and bathhouses, rumors that the grain shipments were smaller this year, that the legions along the Rhine hadn't been paid, that the empire's borders seemed farther away than ever, and yet somehow closer to slipping out of reach. This was no sudden catastrophe, no single spark. It was a slow unraveling. Political decay, economic exhaustion, and a culture drowning in its own weight, a giant too proud to notice how tired it had become. And somewhere, far beyond the city's marble arches and gilded halls, new pressures were building. Migrations, climate shifts, warrior peoples gathering at the frontiers. Rome couldn't see it yet, but history could. Because every empire tells itself it will last forever, and every empire is wrong. This is the story of how the mightiest of them all learned that lesson, slowly, silently, and far too late. Before the swords of invaders ever reached Rome, before the fires, the betrayals, the sacks of cities, the empire was already hollowing out from within. Not visibly at first. The marble still shined, the Senate still convened, the legions still marched. But the foundations, the invisible pillars that held Rome together, were weakening. The weight of an empire too large to hold. The empire sprawled from the deserts of Syria to the fog-choked forests of Britain, a world stitched together by roads, soldiers, and taxes. But stitching is not the same as strength. Every province demanded grain, silver, attention, protection, and Rome, the city at the center of it all, was drowning in its own bureaucracy. Administrators shuffled parchment instead of solving problems. Governors robbed their provinces blind just to stay afloat. Corruption wasn't a flaw, it was the cost of doing business. The empire had become a machine too big for its own engineers. The taxation spiral. In the old days, Rome grew rich simply by conquering. New lands meant new wealth, new slaves, new plunder. But conquest had stalled. The borders were fixed. The enemies were stronger. And suddenly the empire had to rely on something it wasn't prepared for: honest, sustained taxation. The poor paid in wheat or copper. The middle class paid in whatever scraps remained. And the wealthy, the only ones who actually had money, found endless ways to avoid paying at all. So taxes rose. Then rose again. Then rose again, crushing farmers who abandoned their lands in waves. The fields grew empty. The harvests shrank. And Rome, once the granary of the world, began importing more than it produced. An empire starves long before it dies. The army, once Rome's pride, had become Rome's bill. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers required food, weapons, armor, payment. So Rome minted more coins, then more, then even more. But silver cannot be stretched like an empire. The coins grew lighter, then emptier, then worthless. Inflation spiraled, prices soared. Ordinary Romans found themselves living in a world where money meant less each passing season. And as the empire's wealth evaporated, so too did its stability. A government at war with itself. While the economy crumbled, the political machine roared with chaos. Emperors rose and fell like sparks in a fire. A coup here, an assassination there. Generals fighting for the throne while ignoring the frontiers they were sworn to defend. The government didn't just fail to stop the collapse, it caused much of it. Rome had become an empire at war with itself. And in that chaos, as borders weakened and armies thinned, the world outside Rome's walls began to move. Pressures gathered like storm clouds. New cultures shifted. New powers emerged. And distant footsteps, unheard by Rome's elite, were drawing closer. The cracks were no longer hairline fractures. They were widening. Rome liked to imagine its enemies as monsters, wild-haired raiders from frozen forests, swinging crude axes, howling at the gates of civilization. But the reality was far more complicated and far more dangerous, because long before a single sword was raised against Rome, the so-called barbarians were already inside the empire's world, living beside it, trading with it, learning from it, changing because of it. And Rome never understood what that meant. The world was moving, and Rome wasn't. Somewhere far beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers, Rome's great frontier lines, something began to shift in the late 4th century. Ice retreated, grasslands opened, rainfall changed, forests thinned. Climate pushed entire peoples westward in slow, steady waves. Goths, Vandals, Alans, Burgundians, Franks, and behind them all, a thunder like hooves rolling across the horizon, the Huns. A chain reaction of migrations was beginning, a movement of millions, not an invasion, a displacement, a storm Rome didn't cause, but a storm Rome would have to face. And the empire, blinded by tradition and arrogance, assumed the world would stay still simply because Rome wished it so. Rome believed its borders were strong, a line of forts, ditches, watchtowers, and walls stretching for thousands of miles, the outer skin of the empire. But these weren't barriers, they were filters. People crossed them constantly. Traders, mercenaries, refugees, families seeking farmland, tribes fleeing from stronger tribes behind them. And Rome welcomed many of them, not out of kindness, but out of desperation. The legions needed soldiers, the fields needed farmers, the treasury needed taxpayers. Barbarians, Rome said, can become Romans if they obey. But Rome never fully trusted the people it relied on, and the people Rome relied on never forgot it. Seeds of resentment took root long before the first cities burned. Then came the force that Rome truly feared, a people unlike any they had ever encountered, the Huns. Fierce riders from the steppe, swift as shadows, striking without warning. Their arrival sent shockwaves across Europe. Tribes fled before them, not because they wanted to enter Rome, but because the alternative was annihilation. And suddenly, Rome's borders were no longer watching for raids, they were watching for survival. Tens of thousands of Goths gathered along the Danube, begging, pleading to be let into the empire, not as conquerors, but as refugees. Rome could have gained allies. Instead, it created enemies. Officials starved them, extorted them, abused them, until desperation turned to rage. And the empire would soon learn a brutal truth. The barbarians at the gates were not invaders. They were people Rome pushed to the breaking point. By the time the first torches were lit, the first battles fought, the first cities sacked, Rome had already lost something far more important: control. The world was moving, migrating, changing, and Rome, weighed down by pride, debt, and political decay, could no longer move with it. The storm outside the walls was not the cause of Rome's collapse. It was the test that revealed how weak the empire had become. There are moments in history when an empire learns something it can never unlearn. A single day when myth and reality collide and only one survives. For Rome, that day came on August 9th, 378 AD, on a dry plain near the city of Adrianople. It was the moment the world saw something unthinkable: a Roman emperor running for his life, and a Roman army being erased. The crisis that led to Adrianople began with a failure of compassion, and a failure of vision. When tens of thousands of Goths begged Rome for refuge from the Huns, Emperor Valens allowed them to cross the Danube. But Rome didn't treat them as allies. It treated them as prey. Officials stole their food, sold their children into slavery, turned relief into extortion. Starvation did what swords could not. It united every Gothic warrior under a single burning desire: survival. Rebellion followed, swift and inevitable. Still, Rome was confident. Rome always was. Valens believed the Goths were nothing more than a nuisance, wild men with no discipline. He could crush them alone, he thought. He didn't wait for reinforcements from the Western Emperor. It was pride disguised as strategy, and it was fatal. The battle begins and ends. On the morning of the battle, the Roman legions marched under a blistering sun, tired, hungry, divided. The Goths waited on a hilltop, shielded by a wagon fort, a makeshift fortress built from their women, children, and supplies. Valens thought he saw weakness. He actually saw bait. Before the legions could form their battle lines, Roman cavalry charged too early, an impulsive move that shattered the empire's best advantage: organization. The Gothic infantry began to give way. But that was only the surface. Behind the hill, hidden from Rome's view, the Gothic cavalry, fierce, disciplined horsemen, thundered forward. A sound like rolling thunder, a wall of hooves and rage. They slammed into Rome's flanks with crushing force. What began as a battle became a slaughter. Legionaries fell in heaps, shields splintering, lines collapsing. The sun turned the battlefield into an oven. Dust rose so thick that soldiers couldn't see the banners that guided them. Some units fought to the last. Others fled. Most never had a chance. Emperor Valens vanished in the chaos, burned alive in a farmhouse, some say, cut down while trying to escape, say others. No one ever found his body. By nightfall, 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army lay dead. An entire generation of officers, gone. The empire's military backbone, broken. Rome had known defeat before, but never like this. Never against men it once considered savages. Never so decisively. Adrianople was more than a battle. It was a revelation. Rome could lose. Rome could bleed. Rome was mortal. In the aftermath, the empire scrambled to recruit soldiers, anyone, from anywhere. Taxation soared, borders crumbled. Even Rome's enemies realized the truth. The empire was no longer a fortress. It was a wounded giant staggering through history. Adrianople didn't destroy Rome outright, but it knocked out the supports that had held the empire steady for centuries. From this point on, the collapse wasn't theoretical. It was visible, inevitable, and accelerating.